Elizabeth, you wrote a book called Kingdoms of Rage, which sounds like an amazing heavy metal album title. Secondly, you've also done a ton of work um, in Washington, D.C., and you have a really unique perspective on what's going on right now as we think about political polarization, toxic tribalism, conspiracy theories, and even some of the language that I know I've been hearing a lot of lately, which is like threat to democracy. Help us understand what is going on and maybe share some of your experience and your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. I have spent 20 years in the counterterrorism field. I was in DC on 9/11, working for the George W. Bush administration, actually working on his faith based and community initiatives, if anybody remembers that. And after 9/11, the agenda changed and they needed people to help with Homeland Security. And I moved into the White House Office of Homeland Security and did initially answered phones and then eventually started doing some policy work and learned from some really amazing professionals in law enforcement and the military intelligence, and just kind of none of them liked to do writing. They were all operators, and I was pretty decent at writing, so I was like their policy writer while they told me what they wanted to fix. And so kind of learned on the job how to do Homeland Security policy, and I been doing it ever since. And most of that time period, of course, I was focused on the threat from Al Qaeda, and then it became the threat from ISIS, and then it became the threat from US citizens that were radicalizing online, inspired by ISIS. And that was a big shift. And then when I went back into government, I was asked to come and work in the Trump administration. I did not work on his campaign. I was not a Trump supporter, but somebody from the Bush administration that I'd worked with was like, "Hey, we need help. Can you come in?" And I reluctantly said yes. When I'm there, all of a sudden, Charlottesville happens, and then the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue shooting happened. And then Christchurch, which was overseas in New Zealand, but also a white supremacist manifesto that had targeted Muslims. And then we had a few smaller attacks, but the big one in 2019 was the El Paso Walmart shooting. So as you know, that 3-year period I just described is happening, the counterterrorism community is sitting here going, "This is different. What is happening? Are we going back to the 1990s where we had the last spate of um, militia, white power movement, extremists?" And we turned to our intel analysts and like, "Tell us what's happening." And of course, they had not been allowed to look at domestic terrorism much of the last decade, and another story as to why, but they couldn't tell us. They couldn't tell us what was happening. So as a policymaker, that's really hard. You really rely on your intel guys to tell you the facts, to tell you, this is different or this is the same, or so that you know where your leverage points are to be able to build a countering strategy. So we were really kind of flying blind, but it became pretty transparent to us by 2019, despite not having an intel analyst be able to tell us what was happening. No, we have a bigger threat on our hands. We have more Americans, often lone actors, mobilizing to violence for a variety of causes, and very few tools to stop them, because all of our uh, Homeland Security apparatuses, the national security apparatus built to counter terrorism, was focused on foreign terrorist organizations, usually located overseas. And those tools that we built, military, intelligence, and law enforcement, couldn't be applied in a domestic context, often for good reason, because we have a constitution and we don't want the intelligence community spying on Americans. So we kind of were in this place where law enforcement's coming to us going, "We have a big problem on our hands and we can't stop this. Like, people are radicalizing too fast. They're mobilizing to violence super quick. Like, there's not enough time to detect that that a plot is happening." We had juveniles radicalizing to violence, and dealing with juveniles and counterterrorism law, like, it gets a little sticky. It's like actually really hard to prosecute a 16-year-old. So we were scrambling, looking for tools. Like, what can we do to prevent people from mobilizing violence. And so as we were looking at that question, we moved earlier and earlier in the radicalization process. And thankfully, by this time, 15-ish years after 9/11, we understand a lot more about why somebody radicalizes. We used to think, and if you're old enough like me, you'll remember this. We used to think it was the ideology, that there is, a Muslim cleric that's interpreting the Quran a certain way, and their interpretation is that in order to be a good Muslim, you have to commit jihad, and jihad is a violent act, and that you have to go kill infidels. And that's why they attacked us on 9/11. I'm oversimplifying here, but that was what we all were told in the aftermath of 9/11. What we now understand is that that is not why people go and join terrorist groups. Now, ideology plays a role, ideology is important. But one of the critiques today of the past 20 years of counterterrorism is we over indexed on ideology. We spent so much time on it. And it turns out like it's a little useful, but it doesn't actually help stop anything. What does help is if you understand the underlying psychosocial drivers behind why somebody's being drawn to this extremist movement in the first place. And that turns out to be the key when you're looking for how do we stop the violence. We've got to move upstream, meaning way before somebody gets to that moment of, oh, okay, I'm going to go kill somebody today. We need to be engaging them to disrupt radicalization, and possibly even engaging them early in enough in the process so that we're shoring up vulnerabilities, we're building protective factors, so that if they run into an extremist narrative, which I will tell you all of us are today. That wasn't true 10 years ago, but today, if you're an average person, you have run across extremist narratives at this point. And by building protective factors, we can help shore up people's vulnerabilities and make them more resistant to those extremist narratives, hopefully then reducing the number of people that radicalize to extremism. And one more caveat here: most people that radicalize to extremism do not mobilize to violence. It is a funnel. So at the very top of the funnel, might have a lot of people that are vulnerable, a smaller number of people actually radicalize, and then it's a very, very tiny percentage of those that mobilize to violence. The particular problem we have in the country today is that the number of people that are vulnerable and that are radicalizing is significantly larger than it's ever been before. So when you have like in the order of tens of millions, we have studies that show 30 to 40% of Americans believe that violence may be necessary to achieve their political aim. That is a size around 80 million people in the country. We do not have security forces to deal with the potential of somebody in that group may mobilize to violence. So we've got to shrink that. And by shrinking the vulnerability, the vulnerable population, shrinking the radicalization, then we can shrink the number of acts of violence in this country.
So many of us have seen on YouTube or news media clips of January 6th. And I remember watching it, 2021, January 6th, and being awestruck by what I was watching as people were storming into the Capitol. That seems like an extremist act. And what I hear you saying is that there was a process and a permission structure or a narrative structure, an extremist narrative that maybe was happening that would lead people to produce a firearm or produce a weapon and do an act of violence. What are some of you mentioned that we're all hearing extremist narratives. Could you give us an example of an extremist narrative that we might be experiencing and where we might experience it?
Yeah, that's great. So I use the definition of extremism as when an in-group perceives a threat from the out-group to their success or survival, and that hostile action is therefore necessary. So the hostile action piece is really critical to this narrative, because if I take that out and I just say your in-group perceives a threat to your success or survival by an out-group, I would argue that most of our politics are like that. And that's been that way for decades. There's a reason for that. It motivates people to vote. motivates people to contribute money. So politicians and marketers and campaign operatives have learned that fear and anger and outrage are really powerful emotions that drive people to action. So if you're trying to get somebody elected, you try to scare people.
Yeah.
So what I'm not saying is that our politics in general is extremist. I would say it's unhealthy. I would say it kind of sets us up to being susceptible to extremist messaging,
Hmm.
but it's not in and of itself extremist. But you can see if you're bathing constantly in politics and you're absorbing these messages that the libs are out to get us, that they're going to, that there is an agenda to ruin our children, to corrupt our children, through the school system or through, it always changes, right? Like right now, it's really focused on transgenderism. It was a couple of years ago, CRT. Before that, it was anti-wokeism. Like it just, the culture war issue changes. I'm not, to be clear here, I'm not saying that there aren't legitimate, interesting, difficult issues, especially for people of faith, to navigate in today's world. There is an important policy conversation to be had around transgenderism, including the fact that like we can't even seem to have the conversation about the fact that there is now a pretty significant evidence base that says what progressive liberals are suggesting we do with kids actually isn't backed up by the medical evidence, that we might, what progressives are suggesting might actually harm kids, and we should be able to have that conversation without somebody attacking us, and telling us that we're bigoted and anti-LGBTQ plus and all of the things that are happening right now. So I want to be really clear. There are some very challenging things in our country right now, and the way that the progressive left, not the moderate left or the mainstream left, but the way the progressive left operates does make it difficult to have rational conversation, because they do label, they do ostracize, they do cancel. But so does the right? So like we've had this like back and forth, and I don't know, well, I'll let a historian pinpoint who started it. That's not really the point. The point is that the cycle's not working. The cycle of um, hyperbole and everything's an existential threat, and that our way of life as we know it is being ruined. Like it's not healthy. It's not healthy from a secular perspective. It's also not what God teaches us, how we are to interact with the world. Like he actually, Jesus was very clear that we should expect the world to be hostile to our value system. And his model was not to be hostile back. His model was actually turn the other cheek, pray for those who persecute you. Where he expressed hostility was actually internal to the church, to the Jewish leaders of the day, to the elites of his people. It was not. It was not to the Romans, right? Like he was not the revolutionary that the disciples wanted him to be. And I feel like we've kind of gotten trapped in a false narrative that what a good Christian does is stand up to those liberals who are ruining our country. I don't see that anywhere in scripture. I see a standing up that is quiet, a standing up that is loving, compassionate, patient, and truth, grounded in truth, speak the truth, but also speak the truth in love, which is so hard. But that is the call that we have as believers. And when we have turned aside from that call, what we've embraced instead is the ways of the world. And in embracing those ways of the world, we have increasingly seen on the right similar responses to the way that we critique the left in responding, right? Like we are hostile in our tone and actions. We're threatening in our language. We try to cancel. And as I'm describing these actions, the thing that I want to go back to that definition of extremism, hostile action is what makes us move from I'm perceiving a threat to my success or survival, And if my answer is, okay, I'm going to go have a good conversation with somebody and listen to them and try to understand, that's not extremist. That's great. I'm going to go vote. Great. That's a great response to your concern. I'm going to go write a news article. Great. That's a great response to your concern. If your answer is instead, therefore, I need to go harass, bully, intimidate, that's the lower end of the hostile action spectrum. And the concern that I have in particular, this is a security concern. We can also talk about the concern for people's souls, but from a security perspective, when we move into that space of, I can now justify in my head that bullying somebody for my cause, dehumanizing somebody with my language or my treatment of them, intimidating and harassing people, that is okay for my cause, you are now in extremist territory. And as people radicalize, what they do is they go through a self-critique process. They look to see, am I doing enough for the cause? If the answer is no, they escalate. And in that escalation, eventually we move into a criminal space, of maybe it's vandalism, maybe it's destruction of property, or maybe it's a hate crime against a person. Then we get into actual acts of terrorism, and then genocide is the extreme end of that spectrum. Most people are like most people don't move into violence. Most people aren't going to move up that spectrum, but a small percentage do. And the more people you have embracing that lower end of the spectrum, you're going to have larger numbers that move into violence. So the what's incumbent upon all of us is to kind of break the cycle of moving into that extremist space by saying hostility, bullying, harassment, intimidation, even though those are not technically illegal, that they are still immoral. They are still against God's law, against God's call to us. And so that's off limits. I can do my fighting up here, but I'm not going to label liberals. I'm not going to spread false witness about people. I'm not going to, and by false witness, I mean retweeting the thing that you haven't validated is actually true. Or reposting the thing on Facebook that accuses somebody of being a sexual predator when you have no firsthand evidence of that. Just because the influencer that you listen to that says, so and so is, clearly part of an evil cabal of elites, that is not fact-based. You don't have firsthand knowledge. And God says, don't do that. Don't slander. Don't gossip. And we have just as a community adapted and adopted the world standard instead of God's standard. And in so doing, it has opened us up to narratives that hostile action is necessary.
So thinking about that funnel and the spectrum, the people who do extreme acts, so public harassment, vandalism, violence, killing, etc. If I'm understanding you right, if there's 100 people in the pipeline, a small percentage of them will make it all the way down through. But if you get 1,000 people in the pipeline, or 10,000 people, or 1,000,000, the majority won't make it through the pipeline. But the more people in the funnel, the more people that are going to come out on the other side. And
exactly.
One of the things that I've noticed is the people who kind of make it through the pipeline, who brandish a firearm, do an act of violence, that they go back to communities, many surrounded by people, many of whom are in the pipeline. They go back to a church. They go back to a neighborhood. They go back to places where that action that they did is either winked at or celebrated. So I live down the street from the Phoenix FBI building. When the FBI raided the Mar-a-Lago resort a couple of years ago, there was about 40 people in paramilitary-looking outfits with AR-15s slung around their shoulders, waiting for the order to storm the FBI building. This is where around where I walk my dog. So I went up and talked to some of them. They're my neighbors. They're all going back to a community that says, hey, this is fine. This is good. I don't know if you remember the QAnon shaman, Jake Angelini, I think is his name. He was arraigned here. And then he was
Mm.
released a few months ago, and a local church had a welcome home party to celebrate
Mm.
him and to celebrate his actions, and for him to promote some of his material, I believe. And again, everyone in that congregation or that welcome home party, or everyone at the homes of those folks with the AR-15s, they didn't all grab an AR-15. They didn't all uh, go through that pipeline, but many of those people are going back into communities that support that kind of behavior.
That's right.
So for those of us that are reading through your book, Kingdom of Rage, for those even just listening right now, what can we do in our churches and our families
Yeah.
when we maybe have a sense that, you know, Aunt Betty is maybe imbibing some of this extremist rhetoric? You know, she's kind of encouraging somebody to, you know, go through the pipeline. What steps can we take to help people not only not move through the pipeline, but also get out of it?
So the I'll go I'll go back to the underlying psychosocial needs.
Okay.
When people are engaging with that extremist narrative, and often the way that manifests is that, you know, you'll hear them talk about an increasingly concerned or hostile tones towards some outgroup, and they'll frame it in existentially, they're coming for us, or they're you know, if we don't stand up now, like you know, that it'll be too late. And the challenge, I think, when people say that, we treat it very logically. We're like, oh well, like, tell me more about that. And like, oh, I don't know if that's true. And so the normal human reaction is to try to counter with facts. And after somebody has kind of moved into extremist spaces, it's actually really hard to counter with facts, because what brought them there in the first place was not actually the narrative. The
Yeah.
narrative is providing a solution for something else going on in that person's life. And while the risk factors and the reasons why people radicalize are fairly complex, it's not linear. You can't say 1 + 2 + 3 and then, you know, you're there. It is people can jump back and forth. There can be a moment that happens. Often there is a significant, like, life event that has occurred that just kind of creates that opening, and then all of a sudden they've advanced, and maybe they'd heard these narratives all their life, and then all of a sudden they're there, right? So it's I just want to be clear that it's not a sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's sudden, but always there's something unmet underneath, and the risk factors are complex, but you can kind of boil them up to two unmet needs. One is significance, the other is belonging. And in the significance, often the way that that manifests is they've experienced some form of humiliation. It can be individual humiliation. It can be through like a normal type of life event, like losing a job, or losing a relationship. Um, but it could also be something more traumatizing. It can go back to childhood. It could be bullying from childhood that has been buried and comes up for some reason. But humiliation is a pretty key driver and pretty common factor in people that join terrorist groups or move into extremism. The belonging piece is that one's also particularly interesting because in recent years, I would say the last 10 years, um, the way that people move into extremism is almost predominantly online now. So 10 years ago and before, when you were going to radicalize to extremism, it usually had to occur through person to person contact. Somebody introduced you to
Yeah.
these ideas. You might actually go to a group. And so the belonging was actually very real in person contact. Today, the belonging that is getting met is very much more an identity that is being filled by being associated with a movement or a group. And you've actually seen studies taking it out of the extremist context. We've seen a lot more studies that politics is providing identity for people in a way that what used to come from families or churches or communities, say 3 decades ago.
Yeah.
And as we have become more distant from our families, more, because we're more mobile, we don't go to church as much, we don't engage in our communities. People are looking for that sense of belonging, and they found it in politics. So it's actually not surprising at a macro level that the nature of the extremist movements that we're seeing today are kind of coming from the political side in a way that they weren't, say, 40 years ago. But what does that mean for us? There are two pieces that I would love for people to appreciate, because I want you to have empathy for the people that are struggling with this. Like there's something that's happened that's gone wrong in their life, and they didn't have the protective factors in place, or that the people in their life to help them through whatever that rough spot was. But as a group, if you take the Christian and conservative, you can just kind of bucket all of them together. Our group is increasingly experiencing what I would say is group humiliation. Um, some of that humiliation is legitimate in that, and by legitimate, I mean factual. There are things that used to be the way the country worked, and conservative, just that term means we hold to our traditions, right? We like to preserve the way of life, and the world has changed very rapidly. One of the best examples of this was the Obergefell decision back in 2014. So pre-Obergefell, no political candidate would ever run and say gay marriage is good. Post Obergefell, now, like, even a Republican would have to embrace certain aspects of an LGBTQ agenda, if you will. And so if you're a Christian caught in the middle of that was like a whiplash experience of, so gay marriage is not allowed, it's illegal, and now it's allowed. And what does that mean for us as employees? What does that mean for us as pastors? And there's like a whole lot of, like, we got to figure out what this looks like moving forward. And in that space of confusion, because the courts hadn't ruled on things yet, and you have a lot of celebration on one side, and the other side kind of left to, now you're kind of the out group, right? Like, you're not in the mainstream of America anymore. In that space, you had a lot of catastrophizing. You had people, I remember going to sermons saying, like, pastors would not be able to teach an orthodox biblical view of sexuality, and in our lifetime, they're going to be jailed if they try to do so. Now, I think in the years since, we've seen the Supreme Court uphold religious freedom, and that the First Amendment has prevailed. In fact, we have, by some accounts, more religious freedom today than we did in the 1990s. So the catastrophizing has not come true,
Yeah.
and yet we still continue, like, we just change the narrative to whatever the next scary harm is. And so part of navigating in this space as a group is that we have leaders in the Christian and conservative community that are taking advantage of these scary moments. And instead of leading with, okay, what does God tell us to do when the world around us isn't certain and we're fearful? Instead of that being the way in which we're being led, it is, let me tell you all the dire things that are going to happen. And a few of those leaders going to the next step and saying, so, we got to take our country back. And I think
Yeah.
we're going to have to take it back by force. So you better be prepared. The day is coming. And so there is a direct tie here from, the world changed on us. We used to be in the mainstream as Christians. Even if you dig underneath that, there are a lot of ways in which that was not true.
Right.
But it
Right.
felt like we were the mainstream. It felt like we weren't the oddball. And then now we are odd. It is, your beliefs are increasingly weird to mainstream America. And I actually think there's probably a lot of good in that. I
Yeah.
mean, there's like a lot of opportunity for the gospel and being weird. But as a human being, to go from I am normal to I am no longer normal, and people are making fun of me and, like, trying to fire me because I won't show up for the employer's Pride Month activities. Like it definitely is a hard thing to navigate. And so we as a group have experienced that humiliation, as at the same time we are societally increasing and being isolated, and we're not actually experiencing the belonging that comes from community. Those two things combined have just kind of set up a powder keg, if you will, for people to be exploited, for their vulnerabilities to be exploited by extremist narratives.
So if the desire or need is for significance and belonging, and our humiliation and our fear and our isolation are being exploited, how might you encourage us to engage our family members, our friends, folks in our church, uh, to engage folks in those spaces?
With empathy and love, but also truth. In the book, I actually start part two of the book is all about solutions and things we can do. And I start with lament. I think part of the reason we have so many vulnerable people right now is because we have not allowed ourselves to grieve. We skip the grief and we go to anger, and we just stay stuck in anger. But if we were to grieve, there is loss here. The country has changed. Our value systems have changed. Yes, the way that we grew up or our parents grew up is going to look different than the way our kids grew up. And it's okay if there are parts of that that you're sad about, it's okay to grieve that. Um, but also in our lament, part of the reason the Lord instructs us to lament is to help us see our own complicity in some of the brokenness of society, and also to remind us that He's the answer here. It's not going to. We don't need to go try to fix it ourselves, right? Like it is an act of humility to be able to recognize that the world is broken and there are only so many things that we can do, and that this ultimately gets resolved when Jesus returns. So lament is really important. Self-examination is my next encouragement. Please don't go try to fix your Aunt Betty without having done the proper work, as the Lord instructs us to take the log out of our own eye before we try to remove the splinter from theirs. And I have some things for you to consider in the book as it pertains to self-examination. And then when you are moving into the space of caring for a loved one or your community, there are a variety of things that I suggest. Some of them are very practical. A lot of it's based in the social science. But one of the beautiful things that I discovered in this work is that the social science is just backing up what Jesus already told us, right? Like so some of the things that are there, when you come across them, you're like, well, yeah, like I already knew this. And you're like, yes, isn't that great? Isn't it great that Jesus has given us wisdom for the ages, and science is finally catching up? But everything from we need to be better about our media diet, where we get our information from. To we are probably spending way too much time online and not enough time in real life with people. We need to walk alongside people that are suffering so we can learn how to better suffer. We need to be present with those that are suffering, so that they are not alone. And for those like yourself, Caleb, who are pastors and Christian leaders, like we need to recommit to teaching the full context of Scripture, especially how do you walk through trials and suffering. It's almost as if we, and I'm not blaming any one person in particular, but it's the Americanization of Christianity has made it so easy to skip over the discomfort
Yeah.
part of what
Yes.
Jesus says our calling is. And so it makes us really vulnerable, because at some point something bad does happen. And then we're like, how could this happen? Like, I thought if I was a good Christian and I tithed and I showed up at church, that I shouldn't get an illness. I shouldn't
Yeah.
have a child that's not behaving appropriately. I shouldn't get fired from a job. And it's
Mm.
in that space of some sort of trial that we often see people the most vulnerable to those extremist narratives. Um, Practically speaking, though, if you're engaging with somebody and they are all the way down, like they're already there, they're in that conspiracy mindset. Don't argue. You're not going to talk them out of it. You can politely, you can ask, you can be curious. Being curious is sometimes helpful, because in the back and forth, you might be able to determine what's actually that underlying need that has been unmet, like what the true grievance is. But your goal in that case is to maintain a relationship, to show empathy for the grievance, but not affirm the extremist belief. So if the grievance is real, and I need to clarify, there are some grievances that are totally made up and not real, at which point you're still at the surface level. You haven't really figured out
Mm-hmm,
what the
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
true grievance is. But when you can find that real grievance, you can empathize with that. That must have been really hard. Oh wow, I don't know how I would deal with that. That must have been very difficult for you. You can empathize with the grievance. You can let them know they are loved. You shouldn't affirm the extremist belief. And you can let them know, I disagree with that conclusion, but I still love you. And if you'd ever like to talk about something, feel free to come to see me, because what you're hoping is that at some point that individual will become disillusioned. They will run into a space where they will determine, this is actually not meeting the need that I thought it did. That this is actually to borrow from Jeremiah, a broken cistern. It is not meeting my needs. So the hope is that you are kind of that anchor, that safe person that they can come back to when they're ready to get help. And if they do need help, meaning they're really far in, you do need to find a licensed counselor who can help them through navigate how to disentangle and deal with the underlying causes that led them to the extremist place in the first place. You shouldn't try to do that alone.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's so good. So, Elizabeth, just as we finish up, where can people find you in your work?
I have a website, elizabethneumann.org. I work for a company called Moonshot, and we intervene with individuals who are radicalizing online, and offer them psychosocial support. My team at Moonshot does a lot of great work. And then I am on social at New Summits, NEUSUMMITS, which is for X, Facebook, Threads, and Instagram. So various ways to track the conversation there. But the hope I had with the book is that we would start a conversation as a community to figure out a path forward to rebuild flourishing and healthy communities. I think the church in particular has been through really difficult times. And I know I don't have all of the answers, but I'm hopeful that maybe in laying some of this part out from my professional lens, we can figure out a better path forward as a community.
Yeah, I love that. I'm of the same mind. Elizabeth Neumann, thank you so much. Thanks for writing the book, Kingdom of Rage. And for those listening, I highly recommend her work to you. Until next time, we'll see you then.